Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 28th of October 2025. We're here today to start a number of our inquiries looking at issues that are being discussed ahead of the budget on the 26th of November. And today we're looking at taxation of gambling because there's been some speculation that this might be something that's being considered in the Treasury. Though if we went on speculation, we'd be here for a very long time looking at every subject. So I'm really pleased today to welcome our first panel of two this morning to look at this issue. We have from my left to right, we have Carsten Jung, who's the Interim Associate Director for Economic Policy and AI at the Institute for Public Policy Research, known as the IPPR. Welcome, Mr. Jung. He's joined by Dr. Theo Bertram, who's the Director of the Social Market Foundation. And they're joined by Stuart Kenny, who's the former co-founder of Paddy Power. And thank you very much, Mr. Kenny, for travelling to be with us today. We really appreciate that because Mr. Kenny's come from Ireland to join us. So thank you very much indeed. So I was going to ask Yuan Yang MP to kick off, Ms. Yang.
Thank you very much, Chair. To Mr. Young, your organisation, IPPR, has said that gambling is undertaxed. Last year, the effective levy across the whole gambling industry was 22%. Could you just set out why you think that rate is too low?
Yeah, so the way the current tax system on gambling can be described, it's basically a replacement for not levying value-added tax on gambling. So the levies roughly make up for this. And the key argument we're making in our report, building on some of SMF's report, is that gambling is a social harm, and we differentiate between different types of gambling. Some are more harmful than others. Very high rates of addiction, especially among younger men, impacts on their financial well-being, on their social lives, and therefore costs to the overall economy as well. And we do tax other social harms more as a result, from alcohol to tobacco. We recognize that these are not normal goods. They have a societal impact. And that's the reason why we propose some increase in gambling taxation in order to make up for the social harm. So just to quickly run through it, it's we particularly focus on remote gambling, so not the bricks and mortar type, not the horse racing type, but those people sitting at home and gambling and either online slot machines or other types. So remote gambling duty is one way of doing this, raising it from 21% to 50%, increase the machine games duty, which again is slot machine types, not necessarily things that have sort of social interaction attached or a big employment attached. So increasing that from 20% to 50%, and then finally increasing the general betting duty from 15% to 25%. So overall, this would raise about £3.2 billion, and again, this wouldn't sort of be a punitive taxation. It would just recognize the social harms that gambling exerts on society.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And Dr. Bertram, your organisation, the Social Market Foundation, also believes that gambling is undertaxed. And you've made an estimate of the harm that gambling does through problem gambling. Would raising tax on gambling lower the social harms associated, and if so, how?
Yes, so we agree with what Carsten has laid out, and we do think that there is, this industry is high growth, it's high profit, but it's also a high harm to the individual and a higher cost to society, and that's why we think that they can afford and should pay a higher tax. We think that we're particularly focused on where the harm is highest. That's where we're raising the taxed highest. Just to illustrate this, so we're actually proposing, can I pass that around? Is that really right, Chair? It's just, if I pass that?
No, we don't. We can't read it.
I can't do that.
I can read it. People haven't seen it. You can submit it to us.
So it just shows, multiple studies show that at the top of the rate of the rate of harm, you have slot machines, the online casinos, as Carsten has described. And actually at the bottom what you have is traditional sort of betting on horse racing. The level of harm there is much lower. So we're actually proposing not only, as Carsten said, increasing the rate of tax on the highest form of harm, which is that online slots, but we're also proposing protecting horse racing. So in our proposals, essentially horse racing is taxed at the moment at a level of 25%, but the way it's taxed is some of that goes to the Treasury, some of that in the form of the gaming betting duty, and some of that goes to horse racing in the form of the horse racing betting levy. So there's essentially sort of two taxes that combine. One goes to Treasury, one goes to horse racing. And in line with a lot of what the horse racing industry said, we actually think that more of that should go to the horse racing and slightly less to Treasury. So we would keep the level at the same in terms of what you're taxing betting operators, but we would actually put more of that into the sport and horse racing itself. The reason for that is we see that as less harm than the more addictive online slots. And just to give you a sense of the growth in that industry, between 2016 and 2024, the remote gaming grew by 84%. So it absolutely boomed during COVID. You've got people sitting at home on their phones doing gambling. And that's quite different to going to the races and having a bet there. So that's why we're distinguishing between those two things. We're focused on tackling harm.
Just to get a bit deeper, Dr. Bertram, how would taxes, increasing taxation on online gambling, decrease the social harms? What would be the mechanism in terms of the price or market response?
Well, one thing that we might expect to see is that a change in the direction of what the industry chooses to do. Perhaps they can focus more on those areas that are less harmful, and perhaps they can also focus on decreasing those higher harm areas. At the moment, you've got on this online casino, the sort of one where you're just on your phone. This is significantly, many times more, correlates with problem, addictive gambling, and all the costs that come with that. So what we would like to see is a principle in taxation that we are taxing harm in that way at a higher level. And that's something we do in other areas as well in our taxation system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bertram. And Mr. Kenny, you've had a long career in the gambling industry, having co-founded Paddy Power several decades ago and seen the growth of that industry. Do you also believe that different parts of the industry have different levels of harm? And do you think that there are some parts of the industry that are more ripe for taxation?
If there's only one message I get through today, it is that. So betting on horse racing or betting on the next general election is less harmful than betting on fixed odds betting terminals or online slots mainly. And the thing about it is there's two ways of seeing whether a product is highly addictive. How quick is it between investment and result, and how quickly can you repeat the dose? So what the bookmakers, now I was part of the system, I have huge regrets, but I'm still a believer in the gambling industry being part of the entertainment mix. But what the bookmakers are doing at the moment, and they started doing it my day, so you can blame me as well, so I'm not trying to cop out on this one. What they're doing is, when you open an account to have a bet on the next general election or Manchester United to win the Premiership, and you could be very young, remembering that the frontal lobe of the brain doesn't mature till 26, so that very young people are the most in danger. They, within 24 hours, send you free spins in the casino to the online slots. This is like taking somebody from the least addictive product to the most addictive product. It's rather like going into a bar for your first drink and having a shandy. And the barman, after you finish the shandy, says, why not have a triple strength brandy on the house? So, this is taxation. I know you want to raise money, and I understand that. But if we can disincentivize the bookmakers from sucking people from the least addictive product to the most addictive product, that, I think, is the most important.
Now, somebody who's run a gambling company yourself, do you think that other managers now in the industry would react in that way that you described, that they would be less likely to put on those products if the taxes were higher?
Well, I was on the board of Paddy Power and Paddy Power Bet for 29 years. I've been a bookmaker, I'm afraid to say, for too long. I was a bookmaker at school, so that makes it... There's many a story I could tell you about that, but for close to... for over 55 years, so I have a bit of experience. Now, I want to say again, I regret some of the things I did, but I did resign from the board because they withdrew measures, and I had no choice but to resign. They withdrew measures that were going to help gambling addicts. They withdrew advertisements, take a break, you can still see them on YouTube, because too many people who had gambling problems were closing their accounts. And I said, well, isn't that the whole point of it? So I resigned. And yes, I really believe that there's one message I give you is the parts of the industry that have most harm, that you tax higher to disincentivise the bookmakers from sucking you from the sports book into the online casino, because the online casino is a machine. They don't have to have odds makers and risk assessors, so it's not labour intensive, and it's much more profitable.
Thank you, Mr. Kenny. You've been very, very clear.
Thank you. John Clayton, please.
Yes, could I? That's a really helpful characterisation of the different issues with different types of gambling. Thank you, Mr. Kenny. But could I ask Mr. Young? I think it's fair to say that the case that you make is related to reducing child poverty. And I think you make the case in your opening remarks about the different levels of taxation, and this, how do you replicate the sort of similar to VAT? But the Treasury is famously very reluctant to have hypothecated taxes. So how do you get over the fact that this is a statement of principle versus how will, with no hypothecation, how will the money be spent, not just go into general taxation to deal with other issues, rather than actually be used effectively? And if I could just get my questions out quickly, the other part of it is, in terms of the elasticity of demand, you increase the essential cost by increasing the tax. What evidence is there this will have a behavioural effect? I think the psychiatric survey shows, the last one for 23-4, that only 3 in 200 people have a harm. How do we know that these changes are going to actually positively impact both the numbers of people who get into trouble, and actually that there will be spending in areas that will fix it?
Mr. Young.
Yeah. So taking your first question in turn about hypothecation. So I work a lot on budget and treasury issues, so this is close to my heart. So there is, of course, no way we usually do this in budgeting, of linking the revenue here to another issue over there. So the hypothecation would basically be a political one, where government says there is this very real social harm over here, which we have, and we'll get into the elasticities, where we have some room to tax it more and raise revenue. So we're not actually at the revenue maximizing tax rate at the moment. And over here we have another social harm, which across aisles people agree with is a disgrace for one of the richest countries in the world to have this level of poverty, which we could address with overnight with a policy change. And so because these numbers are in similar ballparks, it's a very strong political point that any party should consider making. So, but we're not suggesting any sort of more formal hypothecation. Just to be clear.
So what you're saying is you could raise extra money from this measure, deal with the two-child policy, but you couldn't actually fix the situation for the people who are in problem gambling.
So it depends a bit, and this sort of gets into the elasticity point, how much the increase in tax would reduce problem gambling. So as we just heard, to the extent that gambling becomes more expensive as a result, people might reduce their gambling, and it might prevent some people from becoming problem gamblers on the margin. So you have this basically so-called Pigouvian tax effect. So you tax bad things like cigarettes, and people do less of it. But the child benefit reduction it's not related
but
to
given
that.
Mr. Kenny's evidence around the addictive nature for people under the age of 26, given the development of the brain, is it certain that the increased tax would change behaviour?
It will. So it crucially depends, and again we'll get into this, on how much demand for gambling will be reduced as a result of the tax, how much people will be deterred. So, for instance, gaming machines and remote betting are fairly sort of sticky. So, therefore, you can raise the tax more and raise more money. But it also means people won't simply be some people will be, but not everyone will be deterred by higher rates or poorer odds. And therefore, on its own, I would argue it's not a sufficient policy to address problem gambling. It does a bit, so there will be a reduction in use, but probably not to the full extent that we would like. But then there is other ways other than the tax system to address this, I would say.
Thank you very much, Mr. Glenn. Bobby Dean, MP.
Just continuing on that theme a bit, actually. I mean, we're going to have the Betting and Gaming Council in a moment, and they're probably going to point out to us that taxes went up in the Netherlands and revenue was reduced as a result. That's the claim that they're going to make. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that point that they're likely to make in a moment. Perhaps start with you, Mr. Young.
Sure. So again, there's don't want to get too technical, but there is different stickiness of users of gambling services. So online gaming, for instance, is more fickle in response to lower odds than, say, gaming machines. And so for the more sticky ones, companies will, to some extent, make up for the lost revenue from the higher tax or from the lost profit by lowering the odds for gamers and for people that are betting in order to have a higher margin and restore their profit. That will deter some gamblers, but again, people are sticky, and therefore we'll still have some of the costs passed on to consumers. And then for others, there is actually evidence that gambling companies might have room to actually improve the odds and attract more gamblers in that way, and that also is the revenue maximizing strategy. So, for example, recently we have seen a slight improvement in the win rate, and nonetheless an increase in profits of gambling companies. So the underlying economics of this depends a bit on the cost structure of how these companies work.
Yeah, so I think it's clear. Obviously, when we have these economic problems, the number of variables involved makes it quite hard to predict what the actual outcome is going to be. And I guess this goes to the heart of some of the earlier questions, which is, are we introducing these taxes to raise more revenue to help the Chancellor with her fiscal rules in the next budget, or are we doing it to try and reduce harm? And if we're too successful in reducing harm, then we might end up reducing revenue. Dr. Bertrand, I just want to come in. So do you want to address that?
We're talking. I think absolutely key question you've asked, because I think the difference with this industry is there is this big black market, and I think one of the questions is, if you increase taxes, does it drive people to the black market? And you're absolutely right that the industry will point to what happened in the Netherlands. And in case you haven't seen, Netherlands introduced a tax, and traffic went up to the black market, and the Netherlands didn't recoup any money. So that is an example that they will use, but it's the only example they will use. So let's just look at Netherlands, and then I'll give you all the other countries and some of the research looking at this, because this comes to your broader question about what happens when you tax. So in the Netherlands, not only did they introduce tax, they did a big bang moment. They did a whole load of other regulatory changes as well, which we are not proposing. We're simply proposing to raise tax. The other thing about the Netherlands, I worked for 14 years in the tech industry, having worked with all of the law enforcement in this country, City of London Police, who are excellent, CEOPS, IWF. They will tell you that the Netherlands is the worst place in the world for tackling online criminal sites. It has a notoriously permissive culture, but it also has a very complex court process for enforcement. Fortunately, we don't have that in this country. We are much better, and we're seen as world leaders when it comes to tackling this sort of black market site. And the way you do that is you go after the payment processes rather than after their sites. Now, we've also looked more broadly than the Netherlands, so we've plotted on this graph all of the different countries, what their tax rates are and what their channelization is. So what channelization is, how much of your market is there on in the legal market. So what you would expect to see is a nice graph if there was a correlation between the level of tax and the level of the black market, where the lower the tax, the higher the size of the black market, and where there was a higher tax, you'd expect to see a lower black market. There is no such correlation. In fact, you can look at Estonia. They won't mention this one. Estonia, lower tax, lower share of legal market. Czechs, higher tax, higher share of legal market. There has also been, one of the problems we have in this area is it's very hard to measure, because you're trying to measure something that's a criminal activity, so notoriously always hard to measure, but also most of the research in this area has frankly been done funded by the industry. But there was a paper published earlier this year, and it wasn't paid for by either the industry or people that it would paint as being anti-gambling. It was in the Harm Reduction Journal. It is independently peer-reviewed, and it concludes, this is from the Harm Reduction Journal, 3rd of January 2025, prior industry-sponsored reports have suggested that lower tax rates may be correlated with higher channeling rates. In other words, lower tax means more legal market. The results of our study suggest that higher taxation is unlikely to drive consumption to offshore markets. So it is not the case in the data, with the exception of the Netherlands, I'll explain why that's a unique case, that we see this drive. What matters most is tackling those illegal websites.
Mr. Kenny.
Mr. Kenny, I know you want to come in, but I guess what Dr. Bertram's getting at is there are other tools available to tackle the black market. We have had tax rises in the gambling industry in the past, probably in time in your tenure as well. Can you tell us about the effects that might have taken place at those times when we've seen increases in tax in the gambling industry in the past, and whether or not you saw any potential for the black market to grow at those stages?
Sorry, you're...
Yes,
yeah,
Mr. Kenny, please.
First of all, I'd like to point out in 2019, Ireland doubled the betting tax, and the take went from 52 million to 95 million. And it is more typical. Ireland is more typical. Number one, it's got all the UK companies in, but it is a more typical market. It's basically the same market. There was no rise in black market activity, and I always, when I campaigned for the gambling industry, used to always talk about black market and job losses, and we saw it again when the FOBT legislation was brought in. Oh, this will close all the shops, but it didn't. So it is a bit of scaremongering. So all I can say is my experience is when Ireland doubled the taxation, the take nearly doubled, and the black market did not grow.
Mr. Kenny, I mean, I've got Irish connections. I mean, one of the things about Ireland is that horse racing is sport is a national pastime, but horse racing is very popular. Is that partly because there's a very heavy weight to actually attending sporting events, or is that, are you taking that into account when you say what you said? I mean, well, I'm wondering, it's just that how if you're following the horses,
yep,
you're not going to be the same person who's going to pop in and play on a fixed odds betting terminal. That generation and that culture is very different, isn't it? And that's so embedded in Ireland. Is it that people still wanted to go and have fun at the races?
Well, no, I think the UK and Ireland have about the same rates of interest in horses. The Irish is slightly bigger, but it is not as big. I mean, the urbanisation in Ireland, the horse races attendance are actually falling. And I think when you take taxation rates and regulation, Ireland and the UK are nearly akin to each other. And therefore the doubling of tax, which is now higher, effectively higher, the tax on turnover, is effectively much higher than the UK. The doubling of tax virtually doubled the revenue.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Kelly, I'd also like to talk about Gibraltar. And I've got a statistic here that says 75% of UK online betting takes from or in place at Gibraltar. Can you explain that? Why does 75% of UK online betting take place from Gibraltar?
Well, now, I'd have to say I'm not really qualified to answer it, but if I'm allowed guess, I will. But originally the companies moved to Gibraltar, and we looked to move to Gibraltar, and we looked at Malta, and we looked at numerous other places, was to avoid betting tax. That was closed off, and the corporate rates of tax were lower, and Irish people can hardly lecture anybody on that subject, as we know. I think it was corporate tax rates, but I want to stress I am not totally qualified to answer on that.
Dr. Birchall, I don't know if you want to come in. You mentioned the corporation tax rate being lower, 15%, also no VAT. Are these the simple reasons why people base themselves in Gibraltar, or are there other reasons?
I mean, I think you probably need to ask the next panel that question. I think some of them will know much more intimately. But yeah, I mean, I think when we introduced the 2005 Act, we didn't require onshoring. We didn't really anticipate it at that time. I think that was partially corrected in 2014 with some changes in the way that remote gaming duty was. But
I'll ask you instead a question that maybe you can answer then, which is, in your opinion, is this an issue, or is the way that we tax gambling sufficient, or do we need to make sure that we try to introduce further regulation that means these people are onshore so we can tax their profits as well as particular levies?
I'm sort of in two minds on this. So one mind is like, you know, and I confess I've worked for Google, so I know they've been in front of this committee on this sort of thing before. It's just very hard to globally organise in a way that you can stop that movement of companies to increase tax. But I think it would be great if we could do that. But you know, I think trying to solve that is clearly a Herculean task, but not one that should be given up on. But I think the second point I would make, where it is perhaps more manageable, is you have to have a licence to operate in this country. So what are the conditions attached to the licence? And that's how you can determine what those companies do.
And Mr. Young?
Yeah, and I'm actually glad you brought this up, because the other area where gambling is potentially undertaxed in this country is because you have this offshoring of a lot of companies, and corporation tax is a crucial factor in doing so. So that's just another reason for moving on levies and taxes that we can increase domestically. So so I agree that corporation tax is a key factor for location. I also just quickly wanted to pick up on or like have one very short answer to your point from earlier on can we have it both ways of reducing gambling but also raise revenue, and sort of just in economic terms it completely depends on how elastic demand is, and there is sort of it gets a bad name, but like the Laffer curve is kind of the key way of thinking about this. Because it makes you ask, what is the revenue maximizing tax? And if you are below the revenue maximizing tax, then you can do both things. You increase tax revenue, but you also reduce demand slightly. And so for, say, remote betting, my estimate is that the revenue max tax rate is actually 67%. We're proposing 50%. So this means, because of the stickiness, you reduce demand. Gambling companies increase their margins. So there is sort of a cost for those that still gamble because they get a poorer deal. It's like with the people that still smoke, they pay a lot more in tax. So there is this pass-through, but there is also a hit to company profits. So that's sort of just the economics of it. Like, are we at the revenue maximizing rate? And if we're not, we can increase the rate and both the tax rate, and both increase revenue and reduce incidence of gambling.
I believe colleagues want to come in on this point about Laffer curves with that type of committee. So,
going to our technical expert, John Grady.
Well, I'm not sure I'd say I'm a technical expert, so I think we've heard from Mr. Kenny and Mr. Young that you could significantly increase taxes on online gambling and increase revenue. Is that your position as well, Dr. Bertram?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kenny, I guess just thinking about it from the punter's point of view, if we increase taxes on gambling, how will the gambling companies respond with a view to preserving their profit margins? Will they take a hit on their profits, or will they lower the odds so that basically the people gambling have a lower chance of winning?
The number one, the profits are exploding. I noticed my old firm Flutter is expecting to increase their profits up to close to £1 billion this year. The stock market are expecting that. So there is a lot of profit there that they have. I think it'll be a bit of both, but I do not see, when taxes have increased in, certainly in Ireland, from doubling the tax, profits still increase because gambling profits are exploding. They mightn't increase by quite the same rate, but I see it increasing. I don't see the punters getting a really bad deal. But where my interest is that if we can disincentivize the bookmakers from enticing people into the highly addictive online casino, to make it more worthwhile that they get back to marketing, betting on horse racing and betting on normal events, rather than pushing people and enticing, especially young people. And as I said earlier, the frontal lobe of the brain does not mature till 26. Yeah. That's why it's such good fun to be a student. So, it's really important to protect, because if people are got before then, their lives are destroyed.
And I've seen constituents that have come to see me that have got themselves into very serious financial difficulty over a few days on the online gambling and got into very serious debt and financial issues. So is it your position, Mr. Kenny, that the purpose of a taxation should actually be to reduce gambling and revenue raising is secondary? And is it also your position that we need, and we don't want to get into the detail of a regulation, but actually tougher regulation to bear down and restrict these online gambling activities?
No, far from it. My position is to try, number one, to raise revenue. The government want to raise revenue, and this is a Treasury Committee. So, as I said, doubling of tax in Ireland, virtually double the revenue. My position is to encourage the bookmakers to act responsibly through taxation, to get them back to where they started, encouraging people to have bets on horses and normal events, and to take them out of the more addictive forms of gambling. And so if it became less profitable for the bookmakers in the online casino, it pushes them back into raising revenue through gambling on horses. Now, I know they're going to say that I left 8 or 9 years ago, but I've looked at the betting industry, and they are actually pushing people stronger now than they were, because I had a bee in my bonnet at the time. It was one of the reasons I resigned. They're pushing people stronger towards the online casino than they were then. So I won't buy that, it's all better now. They're much better at the PR of saying what they did, and they're very good at that. But in fact, implementing, I was there, I saw it, and I know it still. They're not doing what they can do. But in the end of the day, regulation is up to government. And the vast majority, I was on the board for 29 years, the vast majority of board members actually believe this is a government problem, and the government must regulate, and it is an unfair pressure to put on boards. Their duty is to stay within the law.
Thank you.
Dame Siobhan McDonald.
Mr. Kenny, what would you say to somebody who said that maybe you had a Canutist view of these things, that you were pushing the future away in a romanticism about the past? And I think maybe we both share a similar past of greyhound racing and horse racing as a great, recreational activity for the whole family. We as kids were, sure you may have been, Meg, go along to the dogs and go along to the races and have a lovely day out. Is that over? Is just the nature, online banking, using cards rather than cash, is gambling just part of that trajectory?
So, first of all, I can understand where you're coming from, and I didn't mean to come across that I'm trying to pull it back to the past. I'm a believer in the gambling industry. I mean, I spent 55 years of my life in the gambling industry, so I really am a believer in the gambling industry. But I think we can discourage things, but it can still flourish. The gambling industry is going to flourish. I'm not trying to close the gambling industry down or prohibit anything. I'm for opening up these things. But I think there are harmful things. And remember, the tax rates in nearly every other country, they're very happy to pay huge tax rates in the States. I think Denver, 53%. So there's huge tax rates. This is about tax that we're talking about. I'm very happy for the gambling industry to flourish, but I don't see why young people or vulnerable people should be pushed into the most addictive form. There's other bundles of other things you can gamble. As I say, the next general election or whatever you want to gamble on.
You keep saying that, Mr. Kenny. Hoping for an inside
We went through
track.
that one last year.
But again, you must know.
If you want the odds, I'll give them to you.
Any stories about that?
Dame Siobhan.
Betting shops.
If you come in on that, that's perfect.
Yeah. Betting shops where somewhere that everybody would go, men and women, it wouldn't be no discipline. But as I left my office this morning, I got into a conversation about it, that's why I was late. Dee in my office said, I used to love to go in the betting shop and, put a bet on a horse for the Grand National or high days and holidays. She goes, betting shops are not the place for women these days, that they attract drug dealing, drug takers, people who have problem drinking in town centres. So are we seeing the marginalisation of gambling?
Well, obviously, retail is suffering in more than betting for online. But I would be a believer in the betting shops, and I believe there should be provisions in any taxation that betting shops will be lower, because I think they can be a real social, for people who don't drink, for people to meet, to have fun. You can have that. What destroyed the betting shops was fixed odds betting terminals. They made them, and the bookmakers should have seen that at an earlier stage. So should the government. But betting shops do have a future, but obviously, like all high streets, they are going to suffer. But tax rates probably won't make that much difference, but I do believe that it would help if they had a lower tax rate in the betting shops, if that's possible practically.
Thank you. Well, on this bit of differentiation, I'm delighted to welcome Bayo Alaba MP, who's a member of the Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, but guesting with this committee today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen. So we just touched on, Mr. Kenny, sort of like the retail and physicals. That's where I really want to sort of like come back in on this. And earlier we spoke about sort of remote gambling and how it sort of grew sort of during sort of COVID. Mr. Jung, you mentioned that, and the sort of the social action, the social interaction, effectively, how it's not there, whereas in the retail setting and retail context, there's far more sort of interaction and monitoring and things like that. So, and then there was another reference to sort of protecting horse racing, effectively. I want to sort of think about the sort of the family entertainment centres. I represent a constituency in Southend, so I'm thinking about your traditional retail sort of family entertainment centres, your arcade sort of venues, part of a British sort of holiday, that kind of thing. And so they employ people, they're monitored, there's a higher level of staff ratio to sort of user. There's a mixture of sort of low stakes gambling, that kind of thing. And so, and I personally think that they are an important contribution to seaside economies, as I said, sort of talking about sort of tourism. So my concern and my question to all three of you really is, do you agree that any increase in gambling taxation shouldn't harm seaside arcades?
Yeah, I can go first on that if you like. Yeah, I mean, I often go to the arcades on Margate, and there's some great ones along there. And when you go in, you've got basically games, and you've got the 2p, you've still got 10p things where you put the thing in and money comes out. Then in a corner of the room, you've got a slightly different thing, which is sort of bit where it's really for over 18s, and it's machines, big machines, where you're basically doing, you're putting money in, and that's really no different to the game that you're playing on your phone. We want to tax that more highly. What we don't want to do is tax those arcades and out of business, but we do want to tax more highly on those things that are highest harm. So when you
Mr. Bertram and Mr. Kenny talked about high harm being that short journey between making the bet and getting the result. That's what you, is that what you also mean by?
So, you can. There's multiple studies done of the different types of betting. So the slot machines, the rate of harm is. So one study has put it at 8 times the rate of harm of a single bet on racing. Another study looks at the prevalence figures for harm by activity. So at the very top, what you have is betting on non-sports events. So that's like me saying, right, I'll bet you the next person comes through the door is a woman. Right, that's a sort of level of addiction of that betting. Second to that is online fruit and slots. It's a long way down the list before you get to betting on sports or in person, and those sort of, those sort of bingo in person. That's even further down the list. So what we're talking about is having a tax system that actually tries to influence and address the rate of harm. At the moment, what we have is a gambling industry that grew 82% on that most harmful form, online slots, between 2016 and 2024. We don't have a tax regime to address that. So that's the change we're proposing. We want to protect not just your seaside resorts, but also horse racing itself. That's one of the reasons why in our proposals we exempt small operators on courses from the levy and from the taxes as well. So there are ways that we can address this tax to address the harmful things, not the type of things that you're talking about.
Mr. Allen.
Brilliant, thank you. And you mentioned sort of Margate. I suggest you visit Southend as well.
I will.
Mr. Kenny.
I would totally agree with everything David just said, 100%. So I won't repeat the same thing again.
Thank you, Mr. Kenny. If only every witness did the same.
Just to add to this, and kind of connecting it to the previous question as well. So one thing we're suggesting is increasing the tax on gaming machines, the slot machines, including in bricks and mortar shops. So there is a debate on where you set the cutoff of when that kicks in. So we're very much in favour of exempting sort of smaller stakes bets, which would affect arcades and seaside towns, for example. But then, and this is linking it to the previous question, is by sort of taxing the most harmful types of machines in bricks and mortar shops, you hopefully would also, through the tax, change the composition of what these shops are made of. So it's not just about is it going up or down in aggregate, but are we sort of incentivizing, relatively speaking, the less harmful types of activity, and that's an important one. Also, I think what you will be hearing from the industry, and maybe we'll get into this a bit more, is that they'll close all the bricks and mortar shops because it's no longer profitable. So based on the data we have and the HMRC commissioned report, this is unlikely to happen. So it sort of gets back into the, will you kill the industry but still raise revenue? So based on the stickiness of customers, you're very much still likely to see these shops to continue. Also, an argument made by the industry is that there's going to be lots of employment losses and customer pass-through. So you can have both. If there's pass-through and high profits, then the activities by definition continue. They're also making this argument that by taxing remote gambling, so online casinos, you'll have lots of employee losses. But as we've heard, there is a higher employment rate in bricks and mortar gambling premises. So I think it's worth, when they come in, scrutinize this point. Like a lot of what we're talking about is remote gambling and is taxing the most harmful machines in bricks and mortar shops, whilst the other activities, are much less taxed, and so the employment effects should be limited.
you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Dame Harriet Baldwin.
This is very interesting because actually when you started this discussion, Mr. Young, with your evidence, you made a statement, a very sweeping statement, I thought, gambling is a social harm. But actually the more we've heard evidence from the panel this morning, the more we've heard, you know, what I observe as an MP in West Worcestershire, where we're near Worcester Racecourse, we're near Cheltenham Racecourse, we have a range of betting shops on our high streets, and we have people who enjoy bingo, we have people who enjoy, you know, betting on football matches. And actually, as the evidence has gone on, you've sort of surfaced actually these sort of things are very much part of the social fabric. You know, there are half the British population probably enjoy taking part in these activities and are not in any way socially harmed by them. So I guess my question, we were just getting to the point there, and Mr. Kenny, you alluded to it earlier, is around the points we've heard from the industry about if taxation is changed in this sector, the level of harm that this will do to people whose livelihood is horse racing, people whose livelihood is running these shops on the high street, people whose livelihood is bingo halls, people whose livelihood relies on running a pub where people come in and use some of these machines. So what you're saying as a panel effectively is all of this is scaremongering. Is that true? That's just what we've just heard from Mr. Young. It's what Mr. Kenny said before. But you know, we would be very concerned if a lot of these activities on which people earn a living in our constituencies were affected by an increase in taxation.
Mr. Kenny.
They said exactly the same when fixed odds betting, if you over-regulated the fixed odds betting terminals, there'd be massive unemployment, that they'd close every betting shop, and it didn't happen.
It's just scaremongering.
It is scaremongering. I mean, look, who am I to say? I played that game. I was head of the Allied Bookmakers Association in Ireland and played that game every time there was mention of a tax rise. And they can say that the world has changed, but it hasn't changed that much. I was using exactly the same arguments 25 years ago. It hasn't. The betting businesses have exploded in profits.
You're saying there would be no change in employment or physical premises in this sector if these changes were to be made?
It's always hard to say no, definitely no. But what I can say is there will be, because other factors come into account, but I do not see any reason why betting shops or people employed in betting shops should go down because of the tax rises. Now, betting shops are closing before these tax rises. So, you know, they've announced quite a few were closing in Ireland and the UK recently. That's long before tax rises. So it is just what's happening.
Quick answers from the others, Dr. Bertram.
Yeah, I think what's happening is you've effectively got two different forms of industries, and one is wrapping itself in the cloak of the other. So the betting industry wants to portray itself as the harmless bet on the Grand National, the flutter in the kinds of arcades that you're describing. What we're really focused on is this app, and you are just sitting on it in your home, and you are losing huge amounts of money in a very short space of time. It's an adversarial relationship between a bookie and a punter. And it may be when you're at a football or when you're in an arcade, you get something out of that even if you lose. I know I've taken my kids to the arcade, they've loved it, even when I've come out going, well, I'm £20 down and all we've got is this tiny little thing. But when you're doing that on your app, there is nothing that you gain. And so what we are saying is you've got to raise the tax on that. And what I'm also saying is that the number of jobs in that area is far fewer. And in our proposals, we're looking to protect those racecourses. That's why we're actually looking to shift the amount of tax that goes to Treasury towards the horse racing itself by the switch from gaming duty to the horse racing levy. And we're also going to exempt small bookies on racecourses altogether. So we're absolutely trying to do what you want to do, which is to protect those kinds of things that we see as there is, even if you lose money, there's something you gain from it because it's a social activity. But don't let the gambling industry pretend to you that sitting on your phone, be addicted to that app and losing thousands of pounds is somehow putting more people in your constituency into work. Because having one person more on that app, 1,000 people more on that app is a negligible cost to them, whereas having 1,000 people more betting on horse racing, which would be good to see, is obviously going to bring jobs to your constituency.
But
So
thank
don't
you.
let them.
And that is just my takeaway from your panel this morning, which has been very informative, is that there is a subset that you're particularly concerned about, which is causing social harm, and not the wider sector. So I'm happy with the evidence I've received.
Thank you very much, Dame Harriet. Jim Dixon, MP, and welcome to the committee as a new member.
Thank you very much. Just a final question, just on this issue of potential economic damage caused by increased taxation. Is there a way of comparing the job creation activity and potential of the industry and its GVA, its gross value added, with other industries, so we can assess the claim that increased taxation is going to cause these harms around unemployment and loss of finance in the economy?
Mr. Young.
Yeah, so is there a way of comparing it? Can you just restate your question?
Industry rate in terms of job creation compared to other industries, and how does it compare in terms of GVA compared to other industries like, for instance, food or restaurants or other sectors, other leisure sectors, for instance?
Yeah, I'd need to get back to you on.
You can write to us if you haven't got the.
Yeah,
there's
I
quite
will do
quite
that.
a lot.
Yeah.
Dr. Bertram, anything to?
No, I'll
Okay.
let custom.
I think Mr. Young will write to us on that. And finally from me to you, Mr. Kenny, I mean, you've been in the business, as you say, 55 years. Do betting shops cross-subsidise from their online activity? Do betting companies cross-subsidise?
Sorry.
Well, are they run as separate businesses? So if Paddy Power's got an online system and you've got shops, do you take profits from the online to bolster the high street presence?
Well, no, the high street is useful for promoting the online, right. And so a lot, the actual seeing the bricks and mortar. Because remember, when you go online, and this is a question about the black market, you are lending your bank card. Now we all know the scams. So the idea, seeing a presence of somebody in the high street gives you trust. And that is why the vast majority of ordinary consumers will not be lending their bank card to unlicensed operators who they have no comeback from.
Okay.
And I would also say what you can do, which we've learned from the tackling sort of the paid movie and copyright pirate issue, is you can go to the payment processors, Visa and MasterCard and so on. There aren't that many that people actually trust. And you can work with them to pull the funding from those sites, because you can identify those sites and then stop that access. So then if someone wants to go and bet there, they're going to need to go in another form of currency, which could happen in form of Bitcoin and so on. But again, you've just raised that threshold for how difficult it is to access the black market.
Well, thank you. I thank our witnesses very much. We've had a lot of layers to this. So you've got the illegal gambling, you've got online, you've got for fixed odds bettings, and you've got the traditional walk into a betting shop on the high street or go bet on horse racing, bingo. Lots of layers to this, and I think the industry's been in the room listening to what you've got to say. So I'd like to thank you all very much indeed. Please do send any information that you would like for us to consider, and send it to us on the record, including the graphs. I think we may have seen those graphs, Dr. Bertram, but if we could have them, it would be very helpful. And could I just encourage you to stay if you wish to hear the next panel, but thank you very much indeed. Order. Order, order. Welcome back to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 28th of October 2025, where we're continuing to discuss the issue of taxation of gambling. And for our second panel, I'm delighted to welcome Gráinne Hurst, who's the Chief Executive of the Betting and Gaming Council, and Stephen Hodgson, who's the Chair of the Betting and Gaming Council's Tax Committee. So very knowledgeable on this subject. And you had a bit of a roasting there from the people who feel that gambling should be more taxed. I'm going to ask you, Anne Yang, to ask you to put forward your points in response to that, Ms. Yang.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Hodgson, we just heard from on the previous panel how the effective average betting levy across the industry as a whole was 22% last year. The industry is obviously exempted from VAT. UK corporation tax is 25%, so the industry is paying less than that effectively. Why is the industry paying so little?
The industry is actually paying a much higher effective tax rate than that, so I'm not quite sure how that number was calculated. But the effective tax rate we see when we look at the whole range of taxes that are paid by businesses in this industry is in excess of 65%, often in excess of 80%. And that is because we have, as you mentioned, the taxes that all businesses pay, such as corporation tax, business rates, employers' national insurance, some of which, of course, have increased recently. We also have irrecoverable VAT, and then we have a range of gambling excise taxes, so general betting duty, machine games duty, remote gaming duty, and several others as well, the economic crime levy and the statutory levy that was introduced earlier this year. So when you add all those taxes up, and also when you take into consideration that many of those taxes are applied at gross profit, so at the very top of the P&L, rather than at a net profit or taxable profit level further down the P&L, which is what you'd expect for corporation tax, that's why you end up with a very high effective tax rate for this industry.
And those the different duties you just mentioned, such as remote gaming duty and so on, they're the taxes that are taken into account in this calculation. So you're saying that the difference between the 22% effective rate, based on all those different gaming and gambling duties, and what you're claiming is the effective rate, what is the difference there? What are the rates that are missing?
I think the difference is, I'm not quite sure where the 22% has come from, but if that is just looking at taxes on the bottom of the P&L, so if that's corporation tax, then that would probably explain it. And if it was corporation tax and that was at 22%, there'd be a myriad of reasons why that might be the case. Most businesses benefit from various different reliefs that mean their effective corporation tax rate is a bit less than the headline rate. I think the most important thing is that effective tax rate, because the vast majority of tax paid by businesses in this industry are the gambling excise duties. So the other taxes, whilst they add to the burden, they are a much smaller piece of the story.
Okay, well, I'll just state that the 22% comes from the adding up all the different gambling, gaming-related duties together and dividing by the revenues, but we'll leave that as a quite technical conversation. I'll move to Ms. Hurst. We just heard from the previous panel about the differential harms in different parts of the gambling industry, in particular from Stuart Kenny, the co-founder of Paddy Power, about the harm of online gambling and app gambling. Do you acknowledge that there are different social harms associated with different parts of the industry?
I think the first thing to say is that I would completely disagree that any gambling products is for part of social harm. I think if you look at 22.5 million people like to have a flutter every month on products with BGC operators. BGC members employ in and around 109,000 people across the country, obviously in high streets and constituencies across the UK, but also in high-tech jobs regionally. And I think if you look at the statistics, the majority of people do so safely and responsibly as part of their leisure. The Gambling Commission, so the independent regulator, published a survey recently which showed that 72% of customers actually gamble because it's fun. So I would completely disagree with the previous session that it causes social harm.
Is your statement there that because it's fun it doesn't cause social harm?
The vast majority of customers that engage with our products do so safely and securely as part of their leisure and entertainment. Only 0.4% of those have a problem with their gambling. And actually the industry has implemented a range of measures, which I'm not sure was picked up in the previous session, in terms of driving up player protection standards. We now operate to the highest ethical standards. The Gambling Act Review White Paper, which the industry fully supported, had 62 additional work streams of additional regulation in order to keep players playing safely in the regulated space. we can talk about that.
I acknowledge that you're stating that you believe the previous panel has over-exaggerated the harms caused by gambling, but even within the industry, we've heard about horse racing, we've heard about physical shops and bets at physical shops, we've heard about online gambling. Do you see different kinds of harm in those different sectors, or do you just see that overall it's all the same, there are no differences in harm between different sectors?
I think the important thing to note is that customers engage with products differently. So the average gambler uses probably 3 accounts. We know that problem gamblers use about 5 different products. So I think it's the way that the customer interacts with the products that is the most important thing. And the industry has a lot of regulation in place now, both mandatorily from the Gambling Act Review White Paper, but also voluntarily through the Betting and Gaming Council to raise those standards. We are now using things like AI and BI in terms of online in order to kind of track behavioural triggers in customers, whether they're playing late at night or whether they're chasing their losses or whether they're playing with different payment methods. So there is a whole raft of additional measures in place to make sure that we are keeping players playing in the regulated space where there are these protections rather than obviously pushing them into the illegal market where there are zero protections.
Given all the different research you've just mentioned, has your industry research found that there are different kinds of problem gambling in different parts of your industry?
So there will be problem gamblers, as I say, use a range of products, and so there will be different product risks for different customers. But I think the key point to note is that the industry has a range of measures in place to monitor what customers are doing and therefore interact with them where we see that they might be facing any harm.
Okay, thank you. And my last question to both of you, perhaps Mr. Hodgson first. You're both ex-employees of the gambling group Entain, and were both working there in 2017 when Entain paid almost £600 million to settle an HMRC bribery inquiry. And a number of those executives who served alongside you are currently facing criminal charges, including bribery, fraud, cheating the public revenue, and tax evasion. Has this inquiry damaged your ability to advocate and be seen as a neutral advocate for your industry?
Well, I think the first thing is to, as you note, say that we're not here in that capacity, neither of us. But I think, look, what you're referring to is a historic issue that relates to a period before either Gráinne or myself worked for that business. So whilst I understand it's a live issue because there have been ongoing investigations much more recently, it relates to a period much before I was in the business, and I think much before Gráinne was in the business as well.
So you're saying that although that inquiry was in 2017 when you were working there, that the behaviour that was going on was from a historic period from then? That's
right. So I mean, that if you look at what has been considered by the authorities, that relates to a period between, I think, 2011 and 2017. Mm-hmm. Now, I was working in 2017 at a business called Ladbrokes Coral. That was a different business to the one you're referring to that has been subject to that investigation.
Is it a different business to Entain, which owns that business now?
Yes, if you look at the history of the M&A. So I accept that Entain is an amalgamation of lots of different businesses, and that's quite common across the industry because of the way businesses have come together. But I don't think it would be fair to say that something that happened in a business that Entain happened to acquire, that it was a business that I wasn't part of, has got any bearing on Entain, and it's not a business I work in anymore.
Ms. Hurst, is there anything you wanted to say?
So I'm in the exact same position as Stephen, in that I wasn't working at the company during that period.
Thank you. Catherine Weston, welcome to the committee as a member.
Thank you very much, Chair. We understand from the evidence given before that there was the 22% average effective betting levy, and then the figure 53% in the US was quoted as the effective levy, and that's quite a big gap for quite a similar society and economy to the UK. So I think if the Chancellor were perhaps be looking to gain revenue from somewhere, perhaps it could come up closer, because that's quite a big gap, 22% in the UK and 53% effective levy in the US. And I was just wondering how you think the industry might manage if it went from 22 to, say, 44 or 50%, given that the other choices on tax, including income tax, VAT, council tax, are actually quite tricky decisions to make politically.
Yeah, so I think maybe if I take the behavioural change, and then maybe Stephen can come in on the effective tax rates, there would be absolutely no doubt that customers would change their behaviour if there was any further additional increase in tax on the industry. We know that the black market is already a really serious threat for the regulated sector in the UK. So Frontier Economics published a report which showed that 1.5 million Brits are already using the black market before any additional changes to tax. They are staking £4.3 billion worth in it, and that is already starving the Treasury of £67 million a year, because obviously the black market pay no tax. They also don't provide any player protections. And we know that if there are any additional tax increases on the industry, the regulated operators have three real levers that are open to them, which is price, promotions and products. So what we would see is that costs would increase for the customer, their odds would get worse, their offers would get worse, the return to players would be reduced. Customers are price savvy and price sensitive. They would obviously notice the change. They would still want to be betting on things as part of their hobby, but they would go to somewhere which is far more attractive, which is already in the black market. So I think we need to be really careful about any additional further tax rises on the industry, because we know that if you tax something more, you get less of it, and customers would change their behaviour.
Yeah,
I think on the effective tax rate.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just come in briefly on that one and say, I think that Gronya's absolutely right. Operators, their response to such a tax increase would be all of those, to pull all of those levers, which makes the offering less competitive with unregulated businesses. With respect to the question about higher tax rates in other places, which I think you were asking about, what we see in some of those other markets and what you really have to focus on is, are those tax rates effective in terms of raising revenue and keeping customers in the regulated market? And the evidence is no. So if you look at some countries both in Europe and some states in the US where they have significantly higher tax rates, we always see a much higher black market component. And that has two consequences. It means, first, the exchequer raises less revenue, and second, consumers are gambling in the black market where they do not benefit from any protection. So I think it would be completely counterproductive to raise taxes to those kind of levels.
Could I just ask about the Frontier Economics, who paid for the research?
That was the Betting Gaming Council.
Thank you. John.
Yes.
John Denby.
Can I just return to this problem of the segmentation of betting? We've all expressed some enthusiasm for, the occasional flutter at the horses and various other things that are occasional and benign in terms of its social impact and impact on individuals. But I found the evidence from Mr. Kenny quite compelling with respect to the terminals and the online activity, which is highly addictive for a certain segment of the population. In your answers, Ms. Hurst, you consciously referred to the range of risks. I understand that, but surely you've got to accept there is a different set of behaviours with vastly different outcomes for those individuals. Isn't it a bit disingenuous not to acknowledge that? Because for us as politicians wanting to see that tax is executed on influenced behaviour, you must surely recognise that. We can have an honest conversation about the different problems that exist.
Yeah, so apologies if I was seeming disingenuous. I was merely trying to make the point that there are different levels of risk for different customers. I think if we're looking and talking about online, you could make the argument that actually there are better protections online than there may be in the retail sector, because online you are able to track your customers' behaviour. As I said, the industry has come on leaps and bounds in terms of what we call markers of harm, where the operators are actually able to look at what a customer is doing in terms of the way they're interacting with a variety of products.
Yeah, I'm aware of those mechanisms to evaluate behaviours, but what I'm talking about is, what do you actually do to stop them getting into problems? We all know the data around the very small number of people that have problems, but those problems are pretty intense and transformational to their life's outcomes. And could you tell us then what the industry is doing to actually stop people that have a problem from... Now, you can certainly use the argument they go off into the black market, but what is the industry doing to actually stop it, not just measure it using AI, etc., etc.?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. There's a range of measures that the industry already have in place, some as a result of the Gambling Act Review white paper, which the industry fully supported, and some which we are doing voluntarily. Probably the most recent development, which we are most proud of in this space, is something called GAM Protect, which is where we've been working with the Information Commissioner's Office to make sure that we get the sandbox right to roll it out. But basically, if there are customers who we know are at highest risk of harm, we are able to share that information with other operators who are in the system, so that we're able to make sure that people aren't jumping from one operator to another.
You don't block them, and your members don't block them.
Yes, we absolutely would. Yeah. So sorry, we would block those customers, and then we would make sure that they're also blocked from the other operators who are part of the scheme. Now, it's a voluntary measure at the moment, which the BGC have instigated. We would obviously like to see that become a licensing condition so that more members are part of the scheme, so that we can protect players more than we currently can do. But we are innovating all the time voluntarily to make sure that we reduce those instances.
Okay. Could we just turn to the issue of the effect of tax and what it would do? We've discussed how the odds would change. A rational economic behaviour of a betting person would be to go somewhere where they get better odds. Can you say a little bit more about how you evidence that and where that's happened in other jurisdictions where taxes have increased? Because, you know, obviously the behavioural effects are usually contested, so how would you justify your position on that?
Yeah, I think there's a few examples we can point to on this. It is really a really important question, because it comes to the crux of everything, which is, I think, you can increase the taxes, increase rates, and end up with less tax and fewer consumers in the regulated market. And, you know, obviously you heard from the previous panellists about the what's happened in the Netherlands. I think there is no doubt there has been an effect there where the tax rate has been increased by a few percentage points earlier this year. And the authorities there themselves say that that has had a negative impact on the amount of customers in the regulated market, with the knock-on consequences that has for tax revenue, which is significantly below what was forecast this year in the Netherlands. There are examples in other places as well, other countries. You know, having spent most of my career in and around this industry, I can tell you that we did see a direct relationship between tax rates and how sensible those rates were and the number of customers in the regulated market. We continue to see that effect today. I think closer to home, you could look at how things have changed in response to previous regulatory change in the UK. The previous witnesses mentioned the restrictions on properties. I mean, since then, and Gráinne might correct me or make this number more accurate, but since then we've seen, I think, 2,500 betting shops close, between 10 and 15,000 jobs lost on the high street. That is a direct consequence of those kind of changes. There are behavioural changes. And I think the most recent one in the UK is probably, if you just look at what has happened on alcohol duties. The alcohol duty regime was reformed and duties were generally increased, particularly on products like wine and spirit. And what the Treasury has said since then is that alcohol duty receipts are down since those increases. So we do see these kind of responses.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So I kind of want to come back to the sort of the physical aspect of this equation. And Ms. Hirsch, you mentioned that 109,000 people are employed in the sector, and the standards are high. And do you see a difference between online and physical sort of standards in terms of how we monitor and support sort of users?
So the BGC represents both. It's the first thing to say. So we represent high street betting shops who have been, you know, in family-run businesses for decades, land-based casinos, bingo, but also the great British business success stories that you see in Ladbrokes Coral, William Hill, Bet365, etc. Our role as the standards body is to continue raising those standards in both the online and the retail sector. We have various work streams for both. I obviously talked about some of the behavioural triggers that we have in the online sector. In the retail sector, there is staff training so that the colleagues in staff are able to spot any potential signs of harming customers. There is interaction training so that they know how best to have a conversation with people that they might see getting into difficulty. So I would say that both the online and the retail sector in the regulated space have the highest possible standards.
Brilliant, thank you. So I represent a seaside constituency full of sort of seaside arcades. We understand their sort of connection to the industry. We're talking SMEs, you're talking long-standing, embedded organisations within the community. So my concern obviously is a disproportionality of the effects of taxation, for example. And so with regards to seaside arcades, you know, they're in a very sort of unique and sort of nuanced position where they can't necessarily sort of put up prices. So do you agree sort of changes in sort of gambling taxation should take this into account?
So the first thing to say is probably that we don't represent the seaside arcades at the Betting and Gaming Council, so that would be for a different association. But I think your point remains the same, that there is a circular economy with lots of these businesses. They will be reinvesting money that they make in one part of their business into another. And so if we see any additional further tax increases on any part of the sector, it is likely to have an effect on the retail side of the businesses, which obviously employ lots of people in your constituency and other members' constituencies around the country, and that's what the BGC are trying to avoid.
Could you explain that and perhaps give an example to just make that live a bit? So this is, if you're taxing something online, you're saying this will have an impact. Could you just give an example?
Yeah, so I guess to give you a real life example from one of our members, the Rank Group, who are one of the biggest casino and bingo providers, in their latest financial results concluded that whilst they made £44 million worth in profit after tax, they actually paid £188 million worth in taxes and duties. Now that's obviously one P&L that the Rank Group have, so that's obviously going to hinder their ability to invest in different parts of the sector. And I think that's really important, that these businesses operate as one profit and loss. So we can't have specific carve-outs, because any additional further tax increases will have an impact on any part of the business. We know from EY modelling, who have looked at some of the proposals from the previous session, that actually worryingly there would be 40,000 potential job losses if we were to see their proposals come into force. The black market would grow by another £8 billion worth of staking, and there would be a huge hit to the GVA of the industry. So the BGC's role is really to highlight to the committee and to the Treasury what negative impacts any additional tax rises would have on the whole of the betting gaming industry and the jobs that it supports.
And Mr. Hodgson, would you like to come in? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Just to echo that point, so these are businesses that operate in an integrated manner. So if you were to increase remote taxes and leave land-based taxes untouched, you would still see a consequence on the overall ecosystem. If you look at some of the larger businesses that the BGC represents, they are quite integrated. That's how they manage to achieve economies of scale and become large, successful businesses that they are. And they will look at costs across the board. They don't look at bits of the business in isolation. It just wouldn't make sense.
Thank you. James Siobhan.
I think we're involved in a giant game of whack-a-mole at the moment in the run-up to the budget, where everybody whacks the tax increase that they could get in order to whack it on to somebody else. And you said, Ms Hurst, we all know if you tax more, you get less. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know that. I think it depends on the tax and how you do it. Mm. And I am just a bit concerned that what we're hearing, which is your job, is we tax more, you get less. If you tax the really lucrative bit of our industry, it'll have an impact on the mainstream gambling that you actually aren't against. And there are a wider group of people who are affected by what has happened to the betting shop on the high street. Mm. Traditionally, betting shops, as I said earlier, men, women, people went there, they met, they had a cup of tea. Today, the experience of betting shops on the high street are quite different in that they have tended to attract more customers with drug problems, with alcohol problems, with behavioural problems that put fear into people in our high streets. And I personally, as a constituency MP, have found some of the businesses that you represent unwilling to take that on.
So I guess I'd make a couple of points in response to that. On the if you tax something more, you get less of it, I was really drawing on something actually that Dame Harriet asked the previous sessions panel that you had here 2 weeks ago when you had the IFS and the Resolution Foundation and others. I think there was a question to the panel, I'm paraphrasing, but do you agree that if you tax something more, you get less of it? And there seemed to be unanimous agreement that that is the case because of behavioural change, and obviously customers change their behaviour. And that's something that we would certainly agree with. We've seen it happen, obviously, in other markets, as Stephen referred to earlier.
Would you address the point of the Irish increase in tax? Do you disagree with Mr. Kenny that the money to the Treasury has doubled?
I'm going to hand to Stephen if that's
no
tax
downturn
expert.
in
Mr. Hodgson.
Participation.
Thank you. Yeah, no, look, I'm really glad you asked that question because I was obviously sat there listening to Mr. Kenny and I honestly couldn't believe what I was hearing because I was very familiar with those changes to the tax rates in Ireland. And I think the first thing to say is they have had a dramatic impact on the retail landscape in Ireland. So since that tax increase in, I think it was 2019, we've seen over 120 betting shops close in Ireland. Now, in the Irish context, that's quite a lot. That's over 15% of betting shops.
There's also been COVID and things in between, so you can't, how can you isolate
there has,
the
but and I think there are a mixture of factors, but that is definitely one of them. So we continue to see betting shops in Ireland today struggling, and that's just a matter of public record. If you just go and look at some of the stories about how that industry is performing right now, it's not a happy story, sadly. And I think the tax increase is a large part of that. If you speak to Irish bookies who are actually working in bookmaking today in Ireland, they'll tell you how tough it is since those tax increases. And you know, Mr. Kenny himself volunteered that he is a long time out of this industry. Well, I know this is Ireland is a bit beyond the remit of this committee, but if you were to go there and speak to some of those businesses, they would tell you a very different story, I think. And you know, the other thing I would point out about the Irish system is two things. It's quite different to the UK system. So traditionally for betting, they have taxed the stake rather than the gross profit of the business. That's something the UK used to do about 25 years ago. It creates a particular friction for the customers, and it creates a more expensive regime. It's not a great approach. It's not one I would recommend. And we see that in most countries that apply the tax at the stake level, so the amount you hand over, it doesn't work particularly well. I think the other thing that's worth noting about Ireland is that they tax online gaming at a lower rate than the UK. So I think when Mr. Kenny talks about the Irish regime being something to look to as an example of where you can double the tax on betting, and he didn't, I don't think, specifically comment on gaming, but if you look at gaming, that's taxed at about 18.7% of gross profit in Ireland, which is lower than the 21% we have in the UK.
Thank you.
Could I just come back in quickly on the betting shops point? So it's not a characterisation that I see or find when I go around to visit the betting shops. Obviously,
Would you like to come to Mitcham Town Centre with me?
Yes, I'd love to.
Right.
There you go. That's
We'll take you on a tour.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that. I mean, when I go around the betting shops, and I would encourage as many parliamentarians as possible to engage with our Grand National Charity Bet every year, what I see is shops that are at the heart of their community. I've also spent time working in shops shadowing colleagues who work incredibly hard and have to deal with lots of...
I think I'm not certainly in any way criticising them.
Thank you. Bobby Dean, MP.
Thank you, Chair. We've had quite a lot of conflicting pieces of data this morning, so I wonder if I could just ask a couple of preliminary sort of clarification questions first of all. I've got profit margins of some of your members here. Entain PLC 24-25 had a profit margin of 25.3%. Flutter, Bet356 and Evoke PLC all above 16%. Are those the kind of profit margins that you recognise? Does that sound about right to you?
So I'll hand over to Stephen in a second.
But just a quick preliminary. Are they in the ballpark of the right?
So over the last 2 years, we've seen the industry grow at about 6%, 4 to 6 percentage points.
Those profit margins are probably about right. We've also seen quite a hefty increase in gambling yield since the pandemic, about 10%. And we see a lot of that in the in the revenue for HMRC via the remote gaming treaty. So is it true also to say that a lot of the growth has been driven by the rise of online gambling since the pandemic?
I think the industry has changed a lot since the pandemic. So if you look at land-based, the shops are down about 30%. If you look at land-based casinos, we've had about 25 closures.
I'm going to take that as a yes. So basically, the industry's made quite a lot of profit. Quite a lot of it in recent years has been driven by online gambling. This brings me to the point I really wanted to come to, which is you said earlier about how the vast majority of your customers do enjoy gambling responsibly. They enjoy the flutter and so on, which I think I accept. But a House of Lords committee report said that actually the vast majority of profits come from a very small number of prolific gamblers. So in fact, they estimate around 60% of industry's profits come from just 5% of customers, many of which probably have a gambling problem or at risk of having a gambling problem. So do you accept when people are making the point about harm that actually there's this tension here for your industry because most of your profit is generated from the people that are most at risk of harm?
So I don't recognise that. If you look at the statistics, actually 0.4% of the population have a problem with their gambling. So the vast
That's where your profits come from. Is what my point is not
that's
about
of the population.
So just to be really clear, my point to you is not about the proportion of your overall gamblers, but where the proportion of where your most profits come from. So here I had the figure of 60% of industry profits come from 5% of customers. So we're not talking about the population as a whole. Do you recognise the fact that most of your profits come from a handful of customers?
So I think with any high volume, low margin business, we are going to have regular customers who are engaged with us. We obviously wouldn't make much money on, the person who has a flutter on the Grand National once a year. But that is like any other business who has engaged customers. They bet with us regularly and recreationally, which we see from the statistics, that the majority of people gamble with us responsibly, and only a small fraction of those get into harm. We obviously in the regulated industry have all of the protections in place in order to make sure that we're spotting any of those potential harms. So I don't recognise those statistics.
Okay, you don't recognise those statistics.
So can I just say, you talk about this 4% figure of the population. What of the percentage of the people who gamble are caused harm? Because they're quite different. You're diluting that figure potentially, aren't you, by taking the whole population?
Yes, so it's 0.4% of the population, which is about 280,000 people.
Okay, well, we'd have to do the maths on that. Okay, thank you. Mr. Dean.
So I just asked those questions because obviously when we're looking to tax the harm that I think you accept does happen within the gambling industry. People do suffer harm within the gambling industry. That's why you take measures to try and tackle that harm. And I guess the government's assessment is, where is that harm still happening? Do we need to go further? Could tax be one of the tools? One of your reposts to that is about the black market. So can I ask, do you trust the Gambling Commission and the tools at their disposal to be able to manage that legal market and ensure that the black market doesn't grow?
So I think the Gambling Commission have been doing an increasingly good job on the black market. It's been one of their key focus areas, I would say, for the last couple of years. There is always more that could be done in terms of, I would invite the committee to go on to Google in your own time and type in non-GamStop casino, and you will see pages and pages worth of black market operators come up on Google. This isn't some kind of dark web where you need secret passwords to get into. It's freely available on search engines and providers. So I do think there's more that can be done in terms of stopping the access to these sites. I do think there's more that can be done in terms of the payment providers in accessing the sites, but I think enforcement is only one element. We also need to stop sending people to the black market, and the best way to do that is to keep the regulated sector attractive and competitive, so that they're not looking elsewhere for better odds and offers and promotions.
You've already alluded to the fact that there's a wide range of tools that you can use to tackle the black market, whether it's blocking payments, whether it's blocking domains, whether it's doing something with licenses. And so your argument at the moment that just increasing the tax will increase the price, will drive people over there, it doesn't seem to quite stack up, particularly with the evidence we just heard in the previous panel, which is comparing some other countries' sort of black market share and tax regimes. So we had the example of Estonia, which has a big black market for gambling, but quite a low tax regime for gambling. Conversely, you had Czech Republic, which has a very small black market for gambling, but quite a high tax regime compared to the UK. So do you accept that link that you're trying to make is quite weak?
No, not at all. Because I think if you look at, I mean, there are lots of other jurisdictions we could talk about. Obviously, we talked about the Netherlands in the previous session. I think also if you look at Germany, they also have 50% of their market is black market. I think the key point in all of this is that we shouldn't be sending customers to the black market where we know there are no protections. I think if you look at, in the UK specifically, how the black market has grown, and you look at the tax take from the regulated sector, you can see the parallels. So the black market has doubled really in the last couple of years. It's still a low percentage, I'm pleased to say, but it is growing from about 2 to 4%. As I said, 1.5 million people are gambling in it, staking about 4.3 billion. If you look at the tax receipts and revenues from the regulated sector, in 2018-19, we were generating £5.5 billion worth in tax and 7.7 in GVA. That's gone down in 24-25 to 4 billion in tax and 6.8 in GVA. So you can almost see that as the regulated sector has become more tightly and rightly regulated as a result of the white paper changes, you are seeing more people using the black market, and you are seeing the tax yield from the regulated sector shrink, which isn't something that we want to see continue.
Okay. And Mr. Hodgson, we spoke a bit about this earlier, and I think you were in the room for it. About 75% of UK betting takes place with bookmakers registered in Gibraltar. Can you explain that for us?
Yes, so there's been a long-standing relationship between this industry and Gibraltar. It's grown up over the last 30 years or so. It originally started in the 90s. At that time, when we just had the beginnings of remote betting and gaming, we saw businesses looking for opportunities where they could obtain a license to allow them to serve markets around the world. And Gibraltar was one of the first jurisdictions in the world to offer that kind of regulatory regime. And it's evolved since, and of course other countries have evolved since then. What's happened as a consequence of that is that since the 90s and into the 2000s, a large sector has grown up in Gibraltar in this industry, and that territory has now become essentially an international centre of excellence for this kind of activity. And I think one of the witnesses in the first session talked about stickiness in a different context, but if you think about stickiness in the context of Gibraltar, you'll see that that's why the industry continues to be very prominent in that particular place. I think it's also just worth saying in relation to Gibraltar, as you'll no doubt be aware, that businesses in Gibraltar and other places outside the UK, as long as they are regulated businesses and UK licensed, and those businesses in Gibraltar are of course dual licensed between Gibraltar and the UK, they all pay UK taxes, so they all pay UK gambling taxes, and that's a situation we've had for over 10 years. And the most important thing is that we ensure that businesses remain in that licensed, regulated sector where they do contribute to the UK exchequer.
So they're in Gibraltar because of historic relationship and it being a centre of excellence. They obviously pay no VAT and a lower rate of corporation tax. Has that got anything to do with it?
Well, look, those are really good questions. I'm glad you asked about the VAT, because there's been lots of myths and misconceptions that I've seen in the press recently on this subject. The reality is VAT isn't applied to betting and gaming because excise duties are applied instead. And that is the situation in almost all of the world. And there are good practical reasons for that. VAT doesn't lend itself particularly well to betting and gaming because you have no obvious buyer and seller. You don't know the value of the transaction until you know the outcome of the bet. If you wanted to apply VAT on betting or gaming, there would be a number of practical difficulties with it. If you went down to the racecourse and you wanted to put £10 on a horse and the bookmaker said, thanks for the £10, now put £2 in this bucket over here for HMRC, and then you win the bet, you go back to the bookmaker, he pays you your winnings, and then he says, I need to grab into this bucket from HMRC and give you some money back. It's really impractical, which is why most of the world doesn't do it. With respect to corporation tax, look, the businesses in this industry do have operations all over the world. What we tend to find, because the UK has been a global success story in terms of betting and gaming, is that we have lots of businesses headquartered in the UK, paying UK corporation tax, but also having operations in a number of other jurisdictions, like Gibraltar, where they will pay local corporation tax in those places. But what you'll also find is that because these businesses, these subsidiaries in other jurisdictions, tend to be part of a bigger global group, there will also be intercompany activity which results in more corporation tax being paid in the UK because they're part of a multinational family, essentially.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the point I was asking Mr. Kenny about, and you mentioned something about the cross-subsidy, Ms. Hurst. You're saying that you have global businesses that will work together, but are shops being subsidised? So just to be clear, shops are being subsidised by online
There's one ecosystem. If a business has shops and online, then that's the ecosystem that's working together. Some shops will be close to not making any profit. And obviously we are concerned that if there are additional tax rises, we would see shop closures. You may have seen in the press recently that Betfred came out to say that if there were additional tax rises, they would close their 1,300 shops.
We know that there's proliferation of betting shops on our high street, but often they are quite marginal businesses if they were standalone. Do you think, though, that bringing up the points James Siobhan was raising earlier, making them more enticing places? I remember, I think when they started serving coffee, but also they've reduced staff. We've had in the past, many years ago, people saying, well, if there's only one member of staff, they can't chat to customers, and it was a social place for a lot of people. Do you think that the industry may have undermined its own shops by making them less welcoming places?
No, so I think shops are great places on the high street. I know you mentioned proliferation. We actually know, as Stephen said earlier, that there have been 2,400 shop closures over the last 5 years. So we're seeing a reduction in shops, not an increase in shops. They are inviting places. You know, lots of the staff in the shops know their customers. They talk to them. I've been in many of the shops when they are talking about their families and weddings and birthdays, and the people that work in the shops are really diligent and hardworking. They could get an easier job without having to work out how to lay the bets and, you know, work under pressure when somebody's coming up really quickly before the race goes off. But they choose to work in them because they're passionate about what they do. We also know from a previous study that 80 to 90% of people who come to visit the bookmakers then also go on to spend money in their local high street. So we're bringing footfall into high streets as a result of the shops.
Okay, so in other industries you can have ring fencing of different types of activity. Is this something that you've considered at the Betting and Gaming Council, so that you have online treated one way, and even though businesses operate as one, that actually ring fencing is something that could be considered, so that you're taxing things on different basis?
They are already taxed slightly differently, which I'll bring
But
Stephen
they're not ring fenced. From what you've been very clear is there's very much one business model which
correct,
that the money from the online will help. So have you considered ring fencing? What the impact would be on the industry?
I think that would be difficult for operators to do, because they obviously will be reinvesting some of their profits back into particular areas within the business that they think is needed. And I think if they were to ring fence particular elements of their offering, that would be quite difficult, but would probably lead to a reduction.
Mr. Glenn.
But surely the point is, if you ring fence these very high margin, highly addictive online entities, you would expose the fact that that is extremely profitable, where all the vast majority of the social ills and the individual problems are, but you would then, you know, avoid the cross subsidy, and then what you're basically saying is you'd see there'd be a detrimental impact on the high street. But the point is that would expose the fact that you've got some businesses that are, you know, fine, not damaging, but low profit, and some that are highly damaging but actually hidden within that ecosystem, as you call it. That's the reality, isn't it?
So I wouldn't accept that different parts of the business are more problematic, as you put it.
You wouldn't accept that highly addictive online gambling is the same as going and putting 10 quid on the Grand National?
So I think gamblers interact with products in different ways. There will be customers.
Surely that basic point is true. You go and put £10 bet on the Grand National. That's very different to online in your bedroom, an 18, 19-year-old or young man being addicted to problem gambling. Surely that distinction is one you've got to make.
So what I'm saying is that customers will interact with products differently. So the customer may
keep saying that phrase, and I don't know what that phrase
yes, absolutely.
means.
When I go to the horses in Salisbury and put 10 quid on a bet, I'm very different to a 19-year-old young man who's online with a problem and is in enormous debt. I accept there's a difference, but surely the industry has got to come to terms with the fact that government and members of parliament don't want that social ill to continue and want to get to the heart of taxing it appropriately. Surely that's a reasonable proposition for us to bring to you and for you to acknowledge and do something about it.
So I'm disagreeing that there is a social ill with gambling. I think that's probably the difference. Now, I fully accept that there will be customers that go in and put a £10 bet on the Grand National, and there will be customers that are playing online. Lots of customers are doing both, I think is an important point to note. So we know that...
You've helpfully set out what the industry is doing to deal with the people, the individuals, and the very small number of people, which I acknowledge, that have got a problem with that intense addiction to online gambling. What we're trying to get to, and why this issue has become pertinent in the right to a budget, is because people and government is frustrated that the taxation of something that does have a significant social ill for those individuals isn't properly addressed in our tax system.
So again, I would disagree that there are social ills as a result of it. I think that it is properly taxed in the system, which Stephen can come in on in a moment. But there are different taxations for different products. We already have that in the system. So sports betting is currently taxed at 15%. Remote gaming duty is taxed at 21%. Our argument is that if you increase any further additional taxes on the industry, and I think it's important to note that the industry is already absorbing £1 billion worth of costs from the Gambling Act Review White Paper, which the industry fully supported, and many of the measures in it are obviously the right thing to do to drive up standards, but that is an additional cost that the industry is having to absorb. So any further tax rises now will put jobs at risk. They will put shops at risk, they will put sports sponsorship at risk, which isn't something that the industry want to see happen, and that's why we're making the case to the Treasury.
Do you just be clear, because you've been quite out with this statement, do you disagree that do you think there are any social ills associated with gambling?
No. I think there are people who...
Is your industry taking measures then?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I think there are people who will have problems with their gambling, but that is 0.4% of the population. Obviously, we are doing everything that we can.
Not of the population of people who gamble, just to be clear about that statistic, which keeps being repeated. So you're saying there are no social ills from gambling?
I'm saying that some people have harm.
So it's down
from
to
their
it's down to the gambler, not the industry.
No, the reason the industry is taking so many steps is because we want to make sure that people continue to enjoy the products safely and responsibly, like the vast majority of people do. But I don't think it's right to categorise the gambling industry as creating social harms, because
So
the
we
vast
just say,
majority...
are there any social harms or ills that come from gambling?
There will be people who get into difficulty with their gambling, and that will
always,
obviously
once again, as you keep saying, it's the people, not anything to do with the industry. Yet you do have measures, as we've heard, about stopping people gambling, but blocking them. While on the other hand, yes, offering free bets and free spins.
So it's definitely the role of the regulated industry to ensure that customers are protected when they're using our products. And the industry have invested a lot of time and money in voluntary measures that we've put in place, as well as the Gambling Act Review White Paper, in order to increase those protections. I'm happy to go through some of those if the committee...
Well, we know what some of those are. We've certainly had evidence on that. We can just be clear. Have you got any independent evidence supporting this position? About that it's not the industry is not creating social ills, it's just down it's the people how individuals choose to interact with it.
So that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the industry has a role to play in making sure that we mitigate any harm that could be caused.
Mr. Grady, just
so if I understand your position correctly, and I'm not very clever, so help me with this. You don't think there are any social harms caused by online gambling, that some people interact badly with it, and I can tell you as a constituency MP, I see terrible harm with people getting into debt. Despite the fact there are no social harms, you've taken steps to prevent social harms, and you can't point to any independent peer-reviewed evidence to support the position. I mean, I just don't understand. Help me out.
So my point was that the industry is doing everything that it possibly can in order to mitigate any harms that may be caused by our products. That's the right thing for the regulated sector to do. The vast majority of customers enjoy our products as part of their leisure. We know that 72% of customers from the Gambling Commission's own survey say that they do it because it's fun. But rightly, the industry is taking additional measures to make sure that the small minority of people who are at risk, we mitigate those harms. And there's a variety of measures, whether that's the GAM Protect scheme that I talked about earlier. We've obviously seen stake limits on online slots reduce recently as a result of the white paper. There are affordability checks coming into force to ensure that customers are better protected. There's a range of measures that the industry are doing, which is right for the industry to do, but you don't get any of that in the illegal market, and that's where we don't want to push customers to.
Well, I
That's
think we
the
would
point
all
I was
agree
making.
on that,
Absolutely.
that final point. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed, Gronya Hurst and Stephen Hodgson from the Betting and Gaming Council. The transcript of this session and the previous one will be online in a couple of days, uncorrected. And we were considering then how we put this to the Treasury, though I'm sure they've been tuning in. I hope they've been tuning in to the discussion. Can I thank you very much indeed. Order.
Thank you.
Order.